The most immediate and main goal of the American Civil Rights Movement was to overturn the system of Jim Crow, the racial system that ruled the South, which included the disfranchisement of blacks, in other words, taking away their right to vote, segregated public facilities, and more largely a system based on racial oppression and a system based on racial violence. It has been as significant a movement for American democracy that we saw in the 20th century. As someone who was not African American, I gravitated into trying to understand the Civil Rights Movement and trying to understand the broader patterns of African American history, because for me, it helped to answer a key question of what it meant to be an American. How do we understand American democracy if we don't understand the larger traditions of African American protest in the midst of slavery, in the midst of segregation, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, in the midst of Black Lives Matter? Studying the Civil Rights Movement in particular has been essential for me in terms of how I see the world. I find that it continues to teach me lessons, and I hope it teaches my students the same lessons about, all right, knowing that experience, knowing what they went through, how should that be shaping how I'm approaching a contemporary issue today in politics, in society, in my interaction with another human being. On the one hand, in terms of its most immediate ramifications, the Civil Rights Movement was successful in overturning the system of Jim Crow that existed in the South in the 1950s and the 1960s. It enshrined through federal law basic citizenship rights, in some ways equal treatment before the law. But the realization of those principles has been, of course, incomplete and imperfect. The broader struggles of the Civil Rights Movement for human rights, for economic justice, for access to the same housing or public services or treatment before the law through the criminal justice system, right? These remain in many ways unrealized gains. In some ways, that is the tragedy that grows out of the Civil Rights Movement years. But if we continue to think about the lessons of that history, it also gives us a language and tactics and a path forward where we can continue to articulate the necessity of fighting for those very claims of justice. One of the enduring legacies of the Civil Rights Movement is the way that it sets up patterns for protest that other groups or people operating in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement adopt and use to their own ends. One of the most effective tactics of the Civil Rights Movement was its ability to mobilize large numbers of people and use them to symbolize a cause for justice, often through nonviolent protest. The signs that were held, the chants that were delivered, the songs that were sung. These were all ways to articulate a larger demand to be included in the democratic tradition in one way or another. The movements for social justice that followed in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement often adapted those same tactics. You could take, for instance, the women's movement of the 1970s, or the battle for LGBTQ rights, or labor unions and their struggles for economic justice over time. Take a more recent vintage of the Black Lives Matter protests, which, while they are in some ways distinct from tactics of the Civil Rights Movement, often also adapt many of those same ideals, many of those same ideas, many of those same symbols, and use them for themselves. There's really no way to teach American history if we don't understand the larger racial dynamic in the United States. It's simply impossible. That's not to suggest that everyone in the United States was fundamentally racist at all times, right? Certainly, and not in the same way, right? One of the important things about the study of history is that you see change over time, and you see elements of progress, and you see elements and ways in which that progress gets checked as well. History is a complex beast. We're constantly seeing ebbs and flows in terms of people's rights, in terms of a nation's path, and you have to take it on its terms. You have to be able to be honest and open and think about all the ideas and all the people and all the motivations that shape human behavior across the past. If you're mandating that you don't teach aspects of that, you are moving into exceptionally uncomfortable territory that is anti-democratic, territory that is anti-American.